Your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Tonight, we continue with The Nightmare on Elm Street, Protege, Chapter 20. The wooden porch steps creaked ominously beneath Jerome's weight as he ascended them. He couldn't escape the feeling that there was something familiar about all this, almost as if he'd been here before. But the last time he'd visited a farm had been during a field trip in 4th grade, and that had been a modern high-tech dairy farm. Nothing like this place. He decided not to worry about it. He'd remember when he was ready. As he stepped onto the porch, he heard something skitter below the wooden planks. Just a rat or a cat, he told himself. Maybe even a raccoon or a groundhog. Nothing to be concerned about. Nothing dangerous. Still, he continued shivering as he stepped up to the rusty screen door. He gripped the cold metal handle and pulled the door open. Hinges that had likely never been oiled since their installation groaned in protest. But the door opened easily enough. Jerome held the screen open with his hip and rapped his knuckles on the surface of the weathered oak door of the house. As he stood there, bathed in the sour yellow glow of the porch light, waiting for someone to answer, he caught a faint whiff of acidic chemicals, and he wrinkled his nose in disgust. The smell reminded him of the hospital he'd been in just that morning, the nauseating stink of medicine and disinfectant. Why would a farmhouse have a smell like that? Cows, pigs, horses, the rank stench of manure. Those were the sort of odors a farm should have. Maybe he was smelling some kind of chemical fertilizer or something. Whatever it was making him queasy, so he decided to breathe through his mouth for a while to avoid the stink. Still no answer. He decided to knock again, only this time he made a fist and pounded the door hard, calling, "Hello! Is anyone home? I need help!" He pounded a couple more times, then waited, listening. At first he didn't hear anything, and he feared the farm's occupants had gone out for the evening and left the porch light burning to serve as a beacon for their return. He was about to turn away and head back to the road when he heard the sound of movement from behind a door. A slow, heavy shuffling as if someone large and overweight was drawing closer. Rather than being afraid, Jerome felt frustrated. All of this, the house, the porch, the heavy footsteps, was so familiar. If only he could... Locks snicked as they were disengaged, and the front door swung open wide. "Hey, Starkey, good to see ya." It was Pat Cottrill. Standing on his right was Brent Haney, and on his left, Eddie Jackson. The three of them weren't exactly in peak condition, though. Pat and Brent were covered with burns, skin cracked and blistered, hair, what remained of it, nothing but scorched stubble. Eddie's face was swollen, bruised, and crusted with dried blood. His hair was a matted tangle, and the top of his skull sat askew, as if it had been removed and then poorly replaced. The three Pusketeers stood almost cheek to cheek, and Jerome couldn't figure out why, until he lowered his gaze from their faces into their body, singular. The three shared one massive muscular body, garbed in jeans and gray sweatshirt that said, "Freddy went to hell and all I got was this lousy shirt, and a couple of extra heads." Jerome took a step back, shaking his head. This can't be real. You're dead. All three of you. With a surge of horror, Jerome then remembered why all of this seemed so familiar. He was living a scene right out of the schlock cult movie Elle had been playing on the monitors at the video store the other night. What was the title again? Two Heads Are Deadlier Than One? But in this version, written, directed, and produced by Freddy Krueger, no doubt, the number of heads had been up to 3. Jerome understood then that he hadn't woken up on the riverbank as he thought. He was asleep or unconscious, maybe even dead. But whatever his specific condition, he no longer inhabited the physical world. He was trapped inside the dreamscape, where, as Freddy had told him, the bastard maniac was God. Jerome turned to run, but the incredible three-headed Pusketeer reached out with one of its meaty, thick-fingered hands and grabbed hold of his shirt collar. Jerome struggled to pull away, but the creature yanked him backward and then wrapped its arms around Jerome's chest in a crushing embrace. "Geez, guys," Jerome said through gritted teeth, "I didn't know you cared." "We don't," Eddie growled, "but Dr. Krueger does." The three-headed Pusketeer dragged Jerome into the farmhouse and kicked the door shut behind them. Outside, dark laughter echoed on the night air. Jameson Velasco, who never allowed anyone to refer to him as Jim, not even his wife, was grinding his teeth. It was a bad habit, one that he was hardly aware he had. But whenever he was upset, which, given his tendency to be overly fussy, was more often than not, he ground his teeth. He just never realized when he was doing it, not unless someone told him. Business was slow at the moment, so Jameson stood behind the front counter, reviewing customer accounts on the computer, flagging those with late fees so far in arrears that it was time to remand them to the collection agency. He felt fingers touch his jaw muscles on each side and began to massage them. He instantly recognized the touch of his wife's and knew that she had caught him grinding his teeth again. He forced his jaw muscles to relax as Miriam worked on them, and he continued reviewing accounts for several moments until she removed her hands and stepped back. "Better?" she asked. Jameson turned away from the monitor screen and gave his wife a lopsided smile, the kind he always gave her when he was both embarrassed and grateful. "Yes, thanks, honey." "Still thinking about the El Dorado, huh?" Jameson shook his head, though he had been, if only a little. "I'm thinking about Ellery." Miriam sighed. "Me too." "Do you think it was a mistake to let him go pick up Cheryl?" Unspoken was the additional thought. "And was it a mistake to lend him our car?" "Why would it be? Her car broke down and she couldn't get a hold of her parents. He just went to give her a ride." Miriam was nearly the polar opposite of Jameson. Where he was high-strung, she was laid back. Where he overthought everything, she tended to go with the flow. For another couple, these differences might have been a source of great friction, but not them. They balanced each other out quite effectively, and it was one of the aspects they appreciated most about their marriage. Because while both of them would have had trouble articulating it, they knew they needed the balance in order to keep them grounded and help them navigate through their daily lives. Simply put, they were badly needed emotional compasses for each other. Normally, Miriam's reassurance would have made Jameson feel better, but not tonight. "That's what Ellery told us, but that doesn't necessarily make it true." Miriam's mouth gaped almost comically in surprise. "You're accusing our son of lying to us?" Miriam liked to believe the best of people, especially when it came to their son. Jameson chuckled. "He's a teenager. Of course he lies to us. The only questions are about what and how often. When he asked permission to go help Cheryl, did he seem to you to be, I don't know, worried, upset, preoccupied?" "Not really. But you were the one he talked to. I was busy with the customer, remember?" "I believe you," she hastened to add, "but Elle's behavior doesn't necessarily mean that something's wrong. Maybe he just has a crush on Cheryl." It was Jameson's turn to be surprised. "But Cheryl's Jerome's girl. Ellery would never come between them." "He might not want to, but he can't help how he feels. Did he tell you he cares for her?" Miriam shook her head. "Not in so many words, but a mother can sense these things." Miriam's intuition was sharper than his, so he tended to give her the benefit of the doubt in situations like this. "If Ellery does have feelings for Cheryl, that makes me even more worried. Jerome's always struggled with his temper. Sure, he's a good kid overall, a hard worker, and a loyal friend to Ellery. But you're afraid that if Ellery ever expresses his feelings to Cheryl and Jerome finds out." Jameson nodded. "I don't mean to say that Jerome would purposely hurt Ellery or anything, but after the last couple days, there was the car accident last night, and while the police had filed no charges against Jerome yet, when they'd spoken to Jameson and Miriam, the officers had hinted that the boys might have been racing. Perhaps Jerome's temper had gotten the better of him, and goaded him into racing the other boys, and Ellery had told them about Jerome's trouble in detention earlier. Not for the first time. Jameson wondered if Jerome might not be the best friend for his son to have. And was Cheryl suddenly thrown into the mix? Well, he wasn't sure what to think. Miriam touched a hand to his cheek, and he realized he'd started grinding his teeth again. "I wouldn't worry too much. Jerome might be going through a bad patch right now, but he'll come out of it okay, and hopefully be all the stronger for having made it." The bell jingled as the front door opened, and Miriam quickly removed her hand from Jameson's face. Not because she was embarrassed, he knew. Hardly anything embarrassed her, but because it might look unprofessional to the customer. But the person who walked in was not a customer. It was Jerome. Speak of the devil, Jameson thought, but when he saw the cold smile on the boy's face and the dead look in his eyes, he instantly regretted it. Unlike both Jameson and Ellery, Jerome had never been overly concerned with looking his best, but his clothes were always clean, his hair washed, face shaved. But this time his clothing was covered with mud, along with darker, harder-to-identify stains, and a rank smell clung to the boy, like something long dead that had been washed up on the riverbank. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Belasco," Jerome said jovially. "Sorry I'm late for work." Jameson saw that the boy hadn't come in empty-handed. In one hand he carried a large plastic grocery sack. A black handle stuck out of the opening, but otherwise Jameson couldn't tell what was inside. I thought you were going to rest at home tonight, dear," Miriam said, sounding both confused and concerned. "To tend to your burn?" Jerome held up his empty hand and turned it back and forth so they could see both sides. There was no bandage and the flesh was smooth, pink, and healthy looking. "I heal fast," Jerome said. Then he lowered his hand to his side. "Where's Elle?" Jerome asked the question easily enough, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in his tone, as if he really wanted to know right now. Jameson started to answer, but Miriam cut him off. "He's on his way to visit you," she said. "You two must have passed each other without knowing it." Jerome gazed at her with two strange eyes of his for a moment, as if trying to peer inside her mind and gauge her sincerity, before finally relaxing. "Maybe we'll run into each other later," he said. "But the people I've really come to see are you two." "Oh?" Jameson didn't like the sound of that. Though he had no real reason to be suspicious of Jerome, he nevertheless edged closer to the portable phone on the shelf below the computer monitor, so he'd be able to reach it and dial for help if needed. "That's right. I had an idea for a new promotional stunt. You know, over by the Highland Apartments. How the management always has someone dress up like a Scotsman in a kilt and hold up a sign saying, 'No security deposit and first month rent is free.'" "Sure," Miriam said. Jameson didn't respond. He was too busy slowly making progress toward the phone. "I thought we can do something similar. Only with movie characters." Jerome turned his back to them and reached into the grocery sack. With a rustle of plastic, he pulled something out and slipped it over his face. Then he gripped the black handle, shook whatever it was attached to, and the plastic bag slid off the object and onto the floor. Jerome turned around and said, "Ta-da!" His voice muffled by the white goalie mask he was wearing. In his hand he gripped the handle of a large machete, its sharp steel blade shining silver as it reflected fluorescent light from the fixtures overhead. "What do you think?" Jerome asked. Jameson and Miriam exchanged glances. "It's, quite eye-catching," Jameson said. "But the machete looks real. Wouldn't it be safer to use a plastic one, like the kind they sell at Halloween?" Keeping his gaze on Jerome the entire time, Jameson bent his knees and reached for the phone. He wasn't sure what this promotional idea was all about, but Jerome wasn't acting at all like himself, and Jameson's instincts told him something was very wrong here. Jerome slashed the machete back and forth several times, the blade softly hissing as it cleaved the air. "Nothing to worry about. It only looks sharp." He angled the machete so the blade pointed straight up. Then he pressed his thumb to the edge. "See?" He started to run his thumb along the blade, but then suddenly jerked it away. "Damn it!" Jerome swore. Blood welled forth from the fresh cut on his thumb. "Just stand still, Jerome," Miriam said. She grabbed a box of tissues from beneath the counter and hurried out from behind it. She'd always been faster to react during a crisis than Jameson. He just stood there, phone in hand, and watched as she pressed a tissue to Jerome's wound. Jerome laughed. "Psych!" He swung the machete and struck Miriam at the juncture of her neck and shoulder. The blade bit deep, and Miriam screamed as her blood sprayed the air. Jerome yanked the machete free and raised it for another strike. Though his face was concealed by the hockey mask, Jameson could see the insane glee shining in the boy's eyes. Miriam stumbled backward and put up her hands to defend herself, as blood continued to pump from the gash in her neck. Jerome took a step toward her, and, without thinking, knowing only that his wife was in danger and needed him, Jameson hurled the phone at Jerome. The hand unit flew through the air and smacked into the forehead of Jerome's mask. It bounced off and tumbled to the floor where the plastic casing broke apart to reveal the electronic components inside. Jerome, quite uninjured, turned to look at Jameson, and despite the deadly seriousness of the situation, the man shrugged almost apologetically. Jerome then returned his attention to Miriam and brought the machete down on her. She screamed once more, but Jerome swung his blood-coated blade 2 more times, and she fell silent. As Jameson looked at her body lying on the tiled floor in a pool of blood, he knew he'd never hear his wife's voice again. Jerome's white hockey mask speckled with dots of crimson turned to Jameson, and he heard the laughter in the boy's muffled voice as he said, "Your turn!" Chapter 21. Jerome struggled against the leather restraints that bound him to the table. He knew they weren't real, that none of this was real, but the knowledge did not do him any good. The restraints held. The basement, along with the makeshift laboratory it contained, wasn't real either. But Jerome could see the bright fluorescence from the light fixture above him, could smell the dust and mildew, feel the cold, dank air on his skin, hear the electronic humming of various pieces of equipment, warming up. For a dream illusion created from his memories of one of El's beloved schlock films, it was damn detailed.
It's always satisfying when one's artistry is appreciated.
Jerome heard feet clomping down the wooden stairs that led to the basement. He strained to see who was coming, more than one person from the sound of it. But the position he was in made it impossible. But then he didn't need to see to know who it was. Who else could it be? Krueger came around to the side of the table, the three-headed Pusketeer right behind him. Jerome could see the ragged stitches where the Pusketeer's three heads were attached to its body. The sewing was sloppy with loose ends of thread sticking out, and Jerome doubted such poor stitching could hold two pieces of cloth together, let alone flesh and bone. But this wasn't the real world, and the rules of logic and cause and effect didn't apply here.
How's our patient feeling this evening?
Krueger was dressed in a green operating gown and surgical mask, just like the mad doctor from Two Heads Are Deadlier Than One.
Are we ready to make medical history?
Ready to tear your goddamn ugly head off, Jerome struggled against the restraints again, but with no more success than before. Freddy's eyes, the only one part of his face visible, gleamed with dark amusement at Jerome's efforts.
Now, don't be like that. Having a positive attitude before surgery can make all the difference in one's post-operative recovery. We wouldn't want you to experience more discomfort than necessary, would we?
Screw you and screw your games, Jerome snapped. If you're going to kill me, why don't you just do it and get it over with? Freddy raised his claw glove, but there were no blades attached this time.
Killing's the least of what I do, kid. Don't get me wrong. I love it and I'm damn good at it. But creating fear, causing suffering, devouring a soul, piece by delicious piece. There are a few of my favorite things.
Krueger chuckled as he pulled a tray attached to a rolling stand toward him. The metal tray was covered with a filthy blood-stained rag upon which rested a collection of rusted metal implements. Knives, corkscrews, hacksaw blades, drill bits. Freddy looked over the assortment for several moments before selecting 4 and attaching them to his glove. When he was finished, he turned and showed Jerome the tools he'd chosen.
I must apologize for the quality of my instruments, but after all, this is a low-budget movie, right?
Drill bit, saw blade, corkscrew, and knife. All 4 rusted, edges and points dull. Jerome didn't want to imagine what the tools would feel like as they worked to penetrate his flesh.
And speaking of our budget, we can't afford anesthesia, so I had to come up with something else to distract you while I'm slicing and dicing.
He nodded at the Pusketeer, and the monstrous abomination lumbered off to one of the basement's shadowy corners. A moment later, they returned, pushing an old-fashioned television set, the kind with the round screen that looked like a monitor from an alien spaceship, set atop a wheeled stand. Grinning with 3 separate mouths, the creature positioned the set near Jerome's head so he could see, then turned it on. The screen flickered to black and white life, displaying an image of a man lying in an alley. Not just any man, Jerome realized. It was Mr. Hauser, his biology teacher, and he wasn't simply lying there. He'd been nailed to the ground with spikes through his hands and feet. He'd been cut open from chin to crotch, and his body cavity had been hollowed out. The man's organs were lying nearby, lined up against a wall in a neat row, and carefully labeled with index cards. Heart, lung, stomach, liver, kidneys, spleen.
Your other self does good work, eh, Jerome? Freddy asked. Very neat and precise. He has all the makings of a first-class surgeon. Or serial killer.
Freddy laughed, and as if the sound were a cue, the TV changed to another channel. Now Jerome was looking at a picture of the school gym. Lying on a wrestling mat was a tangled mound of flesh and limbs. At first, Jerome couldn't make out what he was seeing, and he thought maybe it was some sort of strange mutation like the 3-headed Pusketeer. But as he peered closer, he realized that he was looking at the naked bodies of 2 people that had been tied together into a sick pretzel of broken bones and twisted limbs. It was Mr. Nilsson and Vice Principal LeClaire, and they were both quite dead. Freddy twitched.
Poor thing. I didn't think she'd last long.
The channel changed again, and now Jerome saw the interior of Showtime Video. Mrs. Belasco's mutilated body lay on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Mr. Belasco lay behind the front counter, a figure wearing a white goalie mask crouching over him. The masked man wielded a bloody machete, and he hacked away at Mr. Belasco's dead body with a steady rhythm, as if he was a lumberjack cutting down a tree with an axe. Chuck, 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 chuck. Hockey Mask stopped for a moment, looked toward the camera, and waved. Then he returned to his grisly work. Jerome didn't have to ask who was behind the mask, any more than he had to ask if the same person was responsible for the other murders he'd been shown.
He's doing an even better job than I'd hoped,
Freddy said.
He has a real enthusiasm for the work. Once the bodies start piling up, the people of Springwood will start talking about the latest series of murders to plague their picture-perfect town. They'll wonder who's responsible. Who could have done such a horrible thing? And then they'll start to whisper my name. Just a few of them at first. Just those that remember. But word will spread fast, just like a fire. And before long, everyone will be talking about Freddy Krueger again. Everyone will fear me again. And when that day comes, Springwood and all its children will be mine forever.
Jerome felt sick despair at the images he'd been shown, but he forced himself to keep his emotions in check. Nice try, Krueger, but do you really expect me to believe any of this crap is real? This is the dreamscape, a place of lies and illusions, and you're a master of deception. You're just making this shit up to torment me.
You wound me, Jerome. While I admit that I'm not above indulging in a little creative license now and again, I assure you these images are indeed real. Your brother killed these people, and right now he's finishing up Mr. Belasco while waiting for the arrival of his next two playmates.
The channel changed one more time. The TV displayed a shot of the inside of the car, Elle sat behind the wheel, Cheryl in the passenger seat next to him. I don't know what to do, Elle. If we call the police, Jerome, or at least his body, will end up in prison. And if he manages to get his body back, he'll have to serve time for a murder he didn't commit. Or at least that his personality didn't commit. Elle shook his head. This is getting to be too much for me. All I know is that Jerome's my friend, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect him. But with Becca gone, I don't see who can help us fight Krueger and Jerome's evil psychic twin. Cheryl shrugged. I suppose we'll just have to do the best we can. Jerome hated to hear the numb weariness of a trauma survivor in Cheryl's voice, but he was glad to see her alive and uninjured. The first thing we need to do is find him, Cheryl said. I beg to differ, Elle replied. First, we need to stop by my parents' store. We'll be safe there while we decide what to do next. When Elle said that, Jerome thought he might have felt a surge of jealous anger toward his friend. But now he was merely grateful Cheryl and Elle had each other to lean on. Then he understood why he felt none of his usual rage. It had come from his other personality, and the two of them were separate. For the first time since his birth, Jerome's anger no longer controlled him. But that really didn't matter right now. If the images Krueger had shown him were real, and despite his earlier words to the contrary, Jerome had to assume they were, then Cheryl and Elle were heading straight into a trap, and as long as he was Freddy's captive, there was nothing he could do to help them. Jerome forced himself to look away from the screen and toward Dr. Freddy. He had to think fast. What are you going to do with me? Freddy flexed the surgical instruments attached to his glove.
I thought we'd start off with a little exploratory surgery and then move on from there.
And what about your three-headed assistant? Jerome nodded toward the amalgamation standing next to Krueger. Freddy scowled.
What do you mean?
Aren't you going to get them in on the fun? After all, I killed them. If anyone deserves revenge, it's them. Three pairs of eyes looked at Krueger.
The Pusketeer is my creation, and it'll do exactly what I tell it to.
Krueger leaned his scarred face closer to his patient, and Jerome smelled the faint odor of smoke and seared meat.
You're my plaything, Jerome, and I don't share my toys with anybody.
Jerome glanced at the creature assembled from the remains of his 3 tormentors. He had no idea if they truly were the spirits of Pat Cottrell, Brent Haney, and Eddie Jackson, or if they were simply another one of Krueger's illusions. Either way, Jerome hoped they'd at least react like the real thing. Too bad. You have me strapped down to this table real good. They could do anything they wanted to me, and there's no way I could stop them. The Pusketeers' 3 heads exchanged glances as if they were consulting with one another, though no words were ever spoken. Freddy straightened and chuckled.
Think you're pretty smart, eh? Well, your little ploy isn't going to work, Jerome. Remember what I told you on the lake. This is my world, and here I'm go.
The word was choked off as the Pusketeer fastened its hands around Freddy's throat and squeezed.
He's ours,
3 mouths shouted in 3 separate voices.
He belongs to us.
Freddy struggled to tear the Pusketeer's hands from his throat, but its grip was too strong. Krueger then jammed his glove with the rusted surgical tools into the creation's gut. The Pusketeers' mouths howled a chorus of pain as blood jetted forth to darken the front of Krueger's surgical gown. Freddy yanked his claw glove free of the gut wound he'd created, releasing a fresh gout of dark blood, and then he rammed the instruments into another section of the Pusketeer's abdomen. The creature screamed in 3-point agony but did not release its grip on Krueger's neck. With the strength of 3 men, the Pusketeer lifted Krueger off his feet and hurled him toward a bank of electronic equipment on the other side of the basement. Freddy flew over Jerome's table and slammed into the machinery. And though it looked like nothing more than a cheap movie prop made of metal panels and flashing Christmas tree lights, the equipment exploded in a shower of sparks and a cloud of white smoke. Freddy cried out in pain as electricity coruscated across his gowned body for an instant. Then he fell onto the floor, still quivering from the shock he'd just received. Sporting a trio of evil grins, the Pusketeer lumbered toward its downed master. Jerome was nowhere near the film buff Elle was, but he'd seen enough cheapo horror flicks, mostly thanks to his friend, to know that the hero always got some sort of chance to escape, usually when he least expected it, and in some sort of convoluted fashion. So if this dream scenario followed those rules, the Pusketeer shoved Jerome's table aside so that it could get at Krueger more easily. The table slid into the tray of rusted operating tools, knocking it over. Metal implements coated with reddish-brown flakes flew into the air, and one, a scalpel whose edge wasn't quite as dull as the rest, tumbled down towards Jerome's left hand. It was too good to be true, of course, and in real life he'd never make the catch. But this wasn't real life. The scalpel landed neatly in Jerome's hand. His fingers closed around its handle, and then he carefully turned it over until the blade lay against the restraint binding his wrist. Then he began sawing. The Pusketeer straddled Freddy's chest and locked its hands around his neck once more. It slammed Krueger's head against the basement's concrete floor once, twice, 3 times. Freddy roared with a combination of pain and fury, and he stuck his claw glove against the neck of the Pusketeer's left head, which happened to be Eddie's. Freddy began using a knife claw to cut through the haphazard stitches that held Eddie's head to the Pusketeer's body. Eddie's eyes went wide in alarm, and he managed to shout, "Wait a minute!" Just before Krueger cut the last stitch around his throat, blood gushed. Eddie's eyes rolled white in their sockets, and his head flopped backward, exposing raw muscles and severed neck bone. The head would have fallen all the way off, but the stitches around the back of the neck kept it hanging to the body, if only just. The 2 remaining heads looked frightened as Freddy grinned. "One down!" Krueger jabbed his claw glove at the head on the right, Brent's, and began swiftly cutting through its neck stitches. Jerome kept an eye on Krueger's progress as he continued sawing away at his own leather restraint. Almost there. With one last cut, the restraint came off. Jerome almost shouted in victory, but he kept quiet, not wishing to alert Freddy to what he was doing. With his left hand free, he was able to sit up partially and start sawing at the restraint, encircling his right wrist. He had a better angle this time, and he was able to cut through this one quickly. He then sat all the way up, and since both hands were free, he set the scalpel down on the table and started to undo the buckles on the ankle restraints. Brent's head flopped backward to join Eddie's, both of them staring sightlessly at Jerome as he struggled to escape. "One to go," Freddy said. Pat glanced at the bloodless neck stumps on either side of him, and the fear in his eyes transformed into fury. "I already died once, damn you. I'm not doing it again." Whether this was Pat's real spirit or just a dreamscape copy, It seemed he had the same temperament as the original. Pat, the sole operator of the Pusketeer's body, clamped his hands tight around Krueger's throat and squeezed with all his might. Jerome finished undoing the restraint on his left ankle and started on the right. Freddy jabbed his surgically equipped claw glove at Cottrell's neck, but Pat ducked and dodged, and though Freddy managed to snip a couple threads, they weren't enough. The undead maniac's eyes began to bulge out of their sockets, swelling grotesquely until they looked like white balloons with pupils painted on them. Jerome tried not to stare in horrified fascination at Freddy's bulging eyes and concentrated instead on undoing the last restraint holding him to the operating table. Just a bit more, the last restraint came unbuckled. He was free. Despite himself, he glanced toward Freddy and Cottrell and was shocked to see that Krueger's eyes had swollen to the point where they obscured his entire face. Pat no longer looked furious, but instead scared and sickened. But still he kept choking Freddy, straining so hard that the two heads dangling against his shoulders wobbled back and forth, almost comically. The wide eyes bulged one last time and then exploded in a flood of yellow gunk that looked more like pus than vitreous fluid. Pat was covered by the viscous shit, and several splatters hit Jerome. Since the substance had issued from Krueger's body, Jerome had expected the crap to start eating through his clothes and skin like acid. But it did nothing of the sort. It just clung to his clothing in greasy globs, giving off a rank odor. Pat cried out in alarm, and Jerome looked up to see Freddy looking at the last Pusketeer with empty sockets where his eyes had been. No, Jerome realized, not empty. A slender tendril slithered forth from one socket, followed by another and another. Soon the tendrils were emerging from both sockets, perhaps 24 of them in all. Each tendril had a small fleshy nub at the tip, the skin there puckered and striated like scar tissue. Then the nubs opened tiny bloodshot eyes, and Jerome understood. The nubs were in fact miniature replicas of Freddy's head, complete with hate-filled eyes, hooked noses, and mouths filled with tiny teeth. Very sharp, tiny teeth. Pat still gripped Krueger by the throat, but at the sight of the tendril heads, he let out a shriek and released his hold on Freddy. Pat tried to scrabble backward off Krueger's chest, but it was too late. Like writhing serpents, the tiny Freddy heads struck. They bit into the soft flesh of Cottrell's face with their sharp, yellow teeth and began tearing. Pat screamed in agony and clawed at the tendril heads as they ripped out one tiny chunk of flesh after another with lightning speed. But it was of no use. There were too many, and they were too fast. Within seconds, Cottrell's exertions began to lessen until finally his hands slumped to his sides. He swayed as the Freddy serpents continued to go about their work, and Jerome was sure the Pusketeer's body would have slumped to the floor if the serpents themselves hadn't helped to hold it up. A couple more movements and it was done. The tendril heads had cleaned the flesh from Pat's skull as swiftly and efficiently as a school of piranha. The tiny heads drew back, and now the Pusketeer's body leaned to the right, slipped off Krueger's chest, and smacked onto the floor. The impact was enough to break the last of the stitches holding Eddie's and Brent's head to the body, and they bounced away across the floor like a pair of flesh bowling balls. Jerome sat on the edge of the operating table and stared with disbelief at what was left of the three Pusketeers, and then Freddy turned to look at him, tendril head swaying slowly back and forth.
"Smart move,"
Freddy said in a tone of grudging admiration. The tendril heads echoed his words in a chorus of hissing whispers.
"Smart move, smart move, smart move, smart move."
Freddy got his feet beneath him and stood.
"But you should have taken advantage of your opportunity to escape when you had the chance. Chance.
Krueger raised his surgically equipped glove. The rusted tools were covered with bloody shreds of Pusketeer flesh and bits of thread. There was a soft clicking sound, and the drill bit attached to the middle finger began spinning.
"There might have been a few complications, but as a doctor to patient, I can assure you this operation is going to be a complete success. Success.
While the miniature heads still echoed Freddy's words, Freddy started toward Jerome, brandishing his claw glove with the whirring drill bit. Jerome snapped out of his paralysis and jumped off the operating table. Without looking, he turned to run, and his right hand collided with the screen of the old-fashioned TV set the Pusketeer had wheeled over. But instead of smacking against a glass screen and maybe knocking the set over, Jerome's hand passed through the screen as if it wasn't there. His hand was instantly leached off of all color, but otherwise it didn't feel any different. Jerome withdrew his hand easily, then held it up to examine it. Its normal color had returned, and he wiggled the fingers experimentally. It seemed to be fine. He glanced at the screen. His other self was standing over the bloody, ragged ruin that held little resemblance to Mr. Belasco. The other Jerome still wore the hockey mask, and still had hold of his machete. But he stood unsteadily, teetering back and forth as if on the verge of passing out. But then the other Jerome shrugged off whatever was bothering him and returned to violating what little remained of Mr. Belasco's corpse. A wave of electronic distortion passed across the screen then, and when it cleared, Jerome looked at the TV in wonder. No longer did it display an image of his other self savaging Mr. Belasco's body. Now it showed Becca's smiling face. She looked the way Jerome remembered her, not how he'd last seen her, after his other self had finished with her. She looked whole, healthy, and happy. She met Jerome's gaze, and he had the sense that she was more than just an electronically created picture. She could actually see him. She made a "come here" gesture, but before Jerome could react, the picture dissolved into distortion, and when it cleared, the screen once again showed the interior of Showtime Video, where the other Jerome continued hacking at Mr. Belasco's body with his machete. Jerome had no doubt that he just received a message from his aunt's spirit. He had felt her essence, felt her love for him emanating from the screen, and there was no way Krueger could have faked that. The bastard didn't have it in him. Becca had obviously been trying to help him, but what did she want him to do? Then all at once it came to him. Jerome turned to Freddy. "That's my way back, isn't it? Like Alice through the looking glass? If I go through there, I end up back in my own head, back in control of my body again." He didn't wait for Freddy to confirm or deny it. Jerome turned, stretched out both arms before him, and dived for the TV screen. Behind him, he heard Krueger roar in frustration, and then the sound was cut off as dizzying darkness descended over his consciousness. Chapter 22. For an instant, it felt as if he was no one and nowhere. But then the sensation of vertigo passed and Jerome opened his eyes. He was looking through the eye holes of a mask, and he could feel plastic pressed tight against his sweaty face. He looked down and saw that his clothes were so covered with blood they appeared to have been dyed crimson. In his hand he gripped the handle of a blood-smeared machete, and he straddled a pile of blood, bone, flesh, and organs that had once been his best friend's father. Despite the horror of the scene he found himself in, Jerome felt a surge of triumph. He raised the machete over his head and shook it, sending bits of blood and meat flying. "Fuck you, Krueger! I did it! I'm back where I belong!" A bell tinkled as the front door opened. "Oh my God, what have you done?" Jerome whirled around to see Elle staring at his mother's body in horrified shock. At his side was Cheryl, but she wasn't looking at Mrs. Belasco's corpse. She was looking straight at Jerome, the expression on her face unreadable, but the sorrow in her eyes clear enough. Jerome didn't know how to begin explaining, or even if he could explain. He came out from behind the counter and dropped the machete to the floor with the metallic clatter. He then removed the hockey mask and tossed it aside. "Elle, I know what this looks like." "You son of a bitch! You killed my parents!" Face a mask of loss and fury, Elle came running at him, teeth bared, hands outstretched, fingers hooked into claws, and all Jerome could do was stand and watch him come. Jerome was so surprised by his friend's unexpected ferocity that for a moment he only stood there. The last thing he wanted to do was fight, so he sidestepped as Elle grabbed for him. Unfortunately, the tiled floor was slick with his mother's blood, and Elle's highly polished dress shoes weren't designed for traction. His feet slipped out from under him, and he fell sprawling to the floor. He landed in blood, and droplets splattered into the air. "Elle, wait!" Jerome shouted. "It's me, Jerome, the real one." Elle slowly began rising to his feet, clothes soaked with his mother's blood. Jerome hurriedly continued. "I managed to get control of my body back. I don't know where the other me is gone, but he's the one that killed your parents, not—" He was forced to break off as Elle released a cry of rage and came lunging for him. He sidestepped again, but this time one of his feet came down in a puddle of blood and threatened to slide out from beneath him. He fought to maintain his balance and succeeded in not falling. Unfortunately, his efforts gave Elle the time he needed. He slammed into Jerome's middle and wrapped his arms around his waist. Air whooshed out of Jerome's lungs as Elle tackled, knocked him backward, and the two of them fell to the floor in a tangle of arms and legs. Elle pushed himself on top of Jerome and began hitting him with his fists. Tears streamed down Elle's face, and he punctuated each stroke with a voice thick with grief. "Damn you! Damn you! Damn you straight to hell!" Jerome knew he hadn't been the one who'd wielded the machete against Elle's folks, even though his hand had done the dark deed. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but feel that maybe he deserved Elle's wrath. That he deserved to be beaten to a pulp by his closest friend. If only Jerome had been stronger over the years, he might have been able to keep Krueger from accomplishing his goal of gaining an agent in the real world. Suddenly, Cheryl rushed over and grabbed hold of Elle's arm. "Stop it, Elle! It's Jerome! Our Jerome!" Confusion passed across Elle's face, and he paused in his attack. Jerome watched the struggle on his friend's face as Elle tried to decide what to believe. Grief won out in the end, and Elle's features once more hardened into a mask of fury, and he pulled his arm free from Cheryl's grip. But before he could strike again, Jerome shifted his weight to the side, throwing Elle off balance. Elle slipped off Jerome and fell onto the floor, once more splattering himself with blood. Jerome got to his feet and turned toward Cheryl. "You're right, it is me. I was trapped in the dreamscape while my other self had control of my body. But I've got control again now, and..." Jerome didn't get to finish his sentence. He felt something slam into his side, and he went down hard. His head cracked onto the tiled floor, and a dark wave washed over his consciousness and carried him away. Cheryl watched Elle plow into Jerome and knock him down. He hit the floor and lay there, unmoving. "What the hell did you do that for?" She ran to Jerome's side and knelt down. She was terrified that the impact had killed him, but a quick check revealed he was still breathing, though she had no idea how injured he might be. Elle just stood, fist at his sides, breathing hard from the exertion of fighting Jerome. "Come on, Cheryl. It was a trick. He was lying to us. Our Jerome would never do." He looked at the bodies of his parents, his mother nearby, his father behind the counter, and his face went pale. "Do this." Cheryl took Jerome's hand and gave it a squeeze. It felt so limp and lifeless that she almost started crying. "But Jerome told me he'd just managed to get control of his body back." "At the exact moment before we came in?" "Right. You know what the odds against that are?" He turned and started walking toward the checkout counter. "What are you doing?" "Calling the police." Elle pointed to the broken portable phone lying on the floor. "That unit's been trashed, but there's a regular office phone behind the counter." He took a breath and then added in a softer tone, "Provided I can make myself go back there." "Elle, I can't pretend to imagine I know what you're feeling right now, but please, before you call, think for a minute. If Jerome's personality is in control of his body again, then the police will be arresting the wrong person for killing your parents." Elle didn't respond. He walked behind the counter studiously, avoiding looking at his father's mangled corpse. He reached for the office phone on the counter, picked up the receiver, and started to punch buttons. Cheryl felt fingers close around her neck and cut off her air. "I do what he says, old pal, unless you want to hear what a neck sounds like when it snaps." Cheryl couldn't move her head to look at Jerome, but she didn't need to see him to know what had happened. The other Jerome was back. Elle stared at Jerome for a moment before slowly returning the handset to its cradle. Without slackening his grip on Cheryl's neck, Jerome got up from where he lay and scooted behind her. Then he urged her to stand with him, and, not having a great deal of choice in the matter, she did. Jerome's grip then loosened a fraction, just enough so that she could breathe, but that was all. "You should have listened to her, Elle. My bro managed to find a way to boot me out of the driver's seat. But when you knocked him out, I got a chance to return the favor." He reached up with his free hand and touched the side of his head. His fingers came away tacky with blood, none of which came from Elle's parents. "Looks like I picked up some damage in the process, but that's all right. Thanks to Uncle Freddy, this body can heal minor injuries fast as long as I'm in control. I'll be 100% again in no time, don't worry." He smiled. "Which is more than I can say for you two." Elle's expression was a mixture of fear and anger. "Let her go, whatever your name is, and just get out of here before the cops come." "No need to hurry. You didn't complete your call. And unless an officer suddenly has the urge to rent a Police Academy DVD, I think I'm pretty safe for the time being. And as for my name, I admit, I've never had one of my own. And while I understand it's confusing to keep calling me Jerome, you might as well get used to it. This body, this identity, this life is going to be mine from now on. I am the only Jerome Starkey, the one who had a ball slaughtering your parents." Cheryl wanted to warn Elle that the evil Jerome was just trying to bait him, but she couldn't draw in enough breath to speak. The ploy was working, though. Trembling with fury and sorrow, Elle slowly came out from behind the counter. He began walking toward Jerome and Cheryl, eyes blazing with the need for vengeance.
"The machete's a wonderful invention," Jerome said. "Nowhere near as versatile as Uncle Freddy's knives, of course. But it does have a certain, crude effectiveness, don't you think?"
Elle's gaze fixed on the bloody weapon lying on the floor. Barely pausing in his advance, Elle picked up the machete. He gripped it so tight his knuckles turned white, and still he kept coming toward Cheryl and her captor.
"My bro never gave it much thought, but I figured you've got the hots for my attractive little hostage here. What do you say? Inquiring minds need to know."
Elle's teeth drew back from his lips in a silent snarl. He was almost in striking range, but the evil Jerome showed no sign of nervousness. He held on to Cheryl's throat as tightly as ever, and she wondered if he were going to use her as a shield against Elle. Maybe shove her forward and impale her on the machete. If she had to sacrifice her life to help stop the evil Jerome, then so be it. She wanted to close her eyes, but she resisted the urge. Whatever fate she was about to meet, she wanted to be able to look it square in the face as it came. When Elle was close enough, he lifted the machete in preparation for a strike.
"This is for my mom and dad, you son of a bitch," Elle said.
But before he could swing the blade, Jerome's foot swept out and knocked Elle's legs out from under him. Elle fell backward, losing his grip on the machete as instinctively windmilled his arms to try and catch himself. The machete tumbled through the air, and swift as a striking cobra, Jerome's hand shot forth and snatched the weapon out of the air. Jerome then released his grip on Cheryl's neck as he lunged forward, spinning the machete around in his hand until the blade was pointing downward. Then, just as Elle hit the floor, Jerome stabbed the blade into his chest. Elle's eyes flew wide, and bloody froth bubbled past his lips. His body twitched as if he were experiencing a series of electrical shocks that diminished with each passing second. Blood spread out from beneath his back, giving him a pair of dark crimson wings, as if he were some sort of death angel. His gaze, already dulling, sought out Cheryl, but his eyes seemed to be having trouble focusing because they never fixed upon her. And then, just as she thought he was finally looking at her, his body stopped trembling and went slack, and the last remaining bit of life in his eyes went out in a heartbeat. A final hissing breath escaped his lungs, and then he lay still, staring sightlessly at her, and Cheryl knew Elle was dead. Evil Jerome regarded Elle's corpse for a moment before turning his attention to her.
"That was fun. What do you want to do now?"
Her throat finally free of his grip, Cheryl took a long, deep breath and then screamed as hard and as loud as she could. Jerome opened his eyes and winced as the light sent a wave of pain crashing through his skull. He groaned, as much from exasperation as from the throbbing in his head. He was really getting tired of being knocked unconscious. He opened his eyes once more, but this time kept them squinted against the light. He pushed himself to his hands and knees, moving carefully to avoid slipping on the blood-slicked tile again, and rose unsteadily to his feet. "Cheryl? Elle? She's gone. Unfortunately, am still very much present." The voice came from behind Jerome. It belonged to Elle, but he spoke in a cold monotone with no trace of his usual humor. Unease fluttered in Jerome's guts, and he tried to make himself turn to look at his friend, but he couldn't do it. "When you say Cheryl's gone, do you mean—" "Don't worry, she's still alive, which is more than some of us can say." Jerome then heard a scratching, scuffling sound that made him think of a crab clawing its way across rock. The sound was coming toward him, but he still couldn't force himself to look, nor could he make himself flee. He could only stand there and wait for whatever was going to happen next. "It's too bad you didn't succeed in drowning yourself," Elle said. A second scuttling sound, this one also nearby. "Yes, too bad," a woman's voice, one he recognized. More sounds of movement, these from behind the front counter.
"Would have spared us suffering,"
a breathy gurgle barely recognizing as a human voice, a sound that might have come from a mangled throat and a mouth filled with broken teeth. The scratching, scuttling sounds came from 3 directions now, and they were all converging on him. Jerome, his back still to whomever or whatever made those sounds, imagined 3 human-sized crabs moving toward him like a trio of armored-covered spiders. "I'm back in the dreamscape again, aren't I?" he said. The Belascos, mother, father, and son, ignored his question as they continued crawling across the blood-covered floor toward him. "I thought you were my friend," Elle said. Jerome knew he wasn't hearing the voice of the real Elle, and that this was just another of Freddy's endless supply of torments. Nevertheless, he couldn't allow that statement to pass without comment. He turned to face the Belascos. Elle and Mrs. Belasco were the closest to him, both crawling on all fours, arms and legs outstretched and bent at unnatural angles, heads raised high, eyes that should have been dead instead were horribly alive, moving rapidly back and forth, scanning their surroundings like foraging insects. Mr. Belasco was just coming out from behind the checkout counter, his body a broken, mutilated ruin of meat, bone, and blood that held only the merest resemblance to human form. He was forced to move by pulling himself forward with his only good hand, sliding across the tiled floor, dragging viscera behind and leaving a bloody trail like some nightmarish species of a snail. Jerome knew they weren't real, prayed to Christ that they weren't, but he couldn't keep himself from responding as if they were real. "I'm so sorry." His voice was thick with grief, and tears began streaming from his eyes. "I tried to kill myself, I really did. But it was the wrong thing to do. Freddy wanted me to attempt suicide so that my other self..." The Belascos had continued scuttling and sliding toward him while he talked. Elle was the first to reach Jerome, and without hesitation, he bared blood-stained teeth and bit down on Jerome's left ankle. Jerome howled in pain and tried to shake Elle off, but his friend held on with the tenacity of a pit bull. If anything, his teeth sank even further into Jerome's flesh, and he wondered how long it would be before he felt his best friend's teeth gnawing on the bone beneath. A crazy thought flashed through his mind then. Elle, the real one, would have appreciated the irony of the situation. He'd become a monster starring in his very own schlock horror movie, Night of the Living Belascos. Mrs. Belasco was nearly upon him, and Jerome knew that if she got a hold of him it was all over. He had no idea what would happen to him if he died here in the dreamscape, and he really didn't want to find out. Mrs. Belasco lunged for his other ankle, mouth gaping impossibly wide, as if like a snake she'd unhinged her jaw to feed. But before she could sink her teeth into him, Jerome kicked out with his right foot and connected with her nose. Cartilage smashed, blood squirted, and Mrs. Belasco's head snapped backward with a sickening crack. Jerome had broken her neck. Her body slumped to the floor, and while her eyes didn't stop their hideous back-and-forth movement, and her teeth didn't stop gnashing, the rest of her remained limp as a puppet tossed aside by its master. It was a horrible sight, but he didn't have time to react to what he'd done. Elle's mouth was clamped to his ankle, and like a vice, it seemed to tighten with the passage of each agonizing second. "I hate to do this, Elle," Jerome said through pain-gritted teeth, "but it's you or me, pal." He lifted his right foot and brought it down swift and hard on Elle's neck. Another snap of bone, and Elle's teeth were torn from his leg by the impact. Jerome cried out in pain as Elle's body went limp as his mother's, but Elle's head still held on to its mockery of life, including the power of speech. "You'll never get back to the real world," Elle said. "Your body is lost to you, along with your identity. You're not Jerome Starkey anymore. He is. And you..." Elle paused, and then his lips formed a grin, stretching so wide they split at the edges, sending flesh tunnels of blood streaming down from his mouth. "You're nothing more than a dream." Elle laughed then, as did his mother, their voices wild and mad, like the cries of hyenas in the night. Far worse was Mr. Belasco. The bloody mound he'd become had almost managed to drag itself to the rest of them, and his laughter came as a horrid snuffling of air through a ravaged windpipe. Crimson froth sprang the air like the spouting of a dying well. Unable to stand the hellish laughter, Jerome turned and limped toward the front door, ankle throbbing, left shoe full of blood and squishing with every step that he took. Outside it was night, and a light rain was beginning to fall. There were no cars on the street, and none of the businesses with the exception of Showtime Video had lights on. But otherwise there was nothing to mark the street as out of the ordinary, as something that existed only in Freddy Krueger's diseased imagination. Jerome stood on the sidewalk and stared out into the darkness as rain pattered down on and around him. The drops felt cold on his skin, but they seemed like nothing more than ordinary rainwater. Jerome knew that this could change any second. At Freddy's whim, Jerome might find himself standing in a deluge of urine, or perhaps a shower of razor blades. The sidewalk might turn to hot tar and swallow him, or stone hands might form from the concrete, grab his legs, knock him down, and then begin tearing him apart. Krueger could do anything he wanted, any time he wanted, and Jerome was powerless to stop him. He sat down on the curb, crossed his arms over his knees, and lowered his head. His other self had his body, and far more importantly, had Cheryl, and there was nothing Jerome could do to save her. He'd failed. He heard a sound, a distant rumbling that sounded like thunder, except it didn't pass. It continued growing louder, nearer. He heard dogs barking and cats screaming, and the thunder got louder and louder. But it didn't pass. Light gleamed on the wet street, and Jerome looked up and turned toward its source. He saw a pair of headlights at the far end of the street, and he knew then that what he'd first taken to be thunder was instead the sound of a powerful engine. The vehicle rapidly drew near, and Jerome knew that he should get up, move, seek shelter. But he couldn't bring himself to care. If the car intended to hit him, then so be it. He was too full of despair, too weary, to do anything about it. The car came roaring up, and for an instant Jerome thought it really was going to swerve and strike him. But at the last moment, the brakes engaged, and the vehicle, which Jerome could now see as a red Firebird, fishtailed to a stop directly in front of him. The engine continued to rumble, the front of the car shaking as if it could barely contain the power surging underneath the hood. Tendrils of what looked like steam curled from beneath the hood, filling the air with an acrid stench that smelled like burning hair and flesh. The driver's side window rolled down, and Jerome wasn't surprised in the least when Freddy Krueger's scarred visage leaned out.
Looking for a ride? Gotta warn you though, kid. Ass, gas, or grass. Nobody rides for free.
Freddy brayed demented laughter. I'm not going to play anymore, Freddy, Jerome said in a defeated voice. Just do whatever you're going to do with me and get it over with. Freddy's dark merriment instantly vanished, and he frowned.
What are you talking about? You'll play as long as I say you'll play.
He patted the steering wheel and gave Jerome a sly smile.
Like my ride? It's the same one I used to run down your mother, and that I used to infect you with your dark brother.
As Krueger spoke, long needle-like spikes jutted forth from the Firebird's front bumper. Thick black fluid oozed from their tips, dark seed that instead of creating life was capable only of fostering death. Jerome had a flash of memory, a patchwork of images, emotions, and sensations that he could barely make sense of. He saw a long, sharp object coming slowly toward him, an alien presence invading the warm, comforting darkness that was his entire world. As it pierced the flesh of his umbilicus, he felt terror and pain, and above all, an overwhelming sense of loss. And then he was looking once more at Freddy Krueger's flame-scarred face. Freddy sneered.
A real blast from the past!
What do you expect me to do? Jerome asked. Wail in anguish for my dead mother? Curse you for violating me in the womb? I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I just don't give a damn anymore. Freddy glared at Jerome for several long moments, his eyes blazing with internal fire. Finally, he said,
You're pathetic, kid. Most of my playmates at least have the cojones to go down fighting. I'd finish you off here and now, but you're not worth the effort.
Freddy threw the Firebird into gear and hit the gas. Tires squealed on wet asphalt, and flame jetted out of the exhaust pipe as the car roared off down the street, leaving Jerome sitting alone at the curb in the falling rain. He was beyond feeling despair, beyond feeling anything, and that's when he heard a soft, gentle voice whisper his name. Jerome. A woman's voice, one he knew well. It seemed to come from below him, so he looked down and saw that a puddle of rainwater had formed in the gutter. Light from the Showtime video sign was reflected in the water, along with Becca's face. Jerome quickly looked over his shoulder, expecting to see his aunt standing behind him. But aside from himself, the sidewalk was empty. He turned back to look to the puddle and saw that Becca was now smiling at him. This is just another trick. You're not real. Becca replied, her voice faint, as if she were speaking to him across a giant distance. Search your feelings, Jerome. You know it's not a trick. For the first time since walking out of the video store, Jerome did feel something. He felt love and hope. This was Becca, all right. How? We don't have much time. Freddy has momentarily drawn his awareness from you in disgust over your refusing to amuse him. That's given me a few precious moments to contact you without him knowing. But we have to be quick before he senses my intrusion into his realm. So just listen, hon, all right? Jerome nodded. There's still a chance for you to regain control of your body. Right now, this section of the dreamscape mirrors the layout of the actual Springwood. If you can occupy the same space here as your other self does in the physical world, then you can attempt to force him out of your body and retake control, just as you did in the video store. But how do I know where he's at? I can't see into the real world from here, and I have no idea where he'd go. Don't you? Becca said with a tone of sadness. He's killed off everyone you know or care for. Who's left? Jerome felt a cold twist of fear knot his gut. My family! His dad, Lynn, Brian, and Mary. Yes, once you're close enough to him, you'll be able to sense his presence. But you'll have to act swiftly, because he'll be able to sense you as well. She paused and looked past Jerome as if someone were approaching him from behind. She then looked back to Jerome. He's found me. Good luck, sweetheart. Stay strong. The puddle suddenly burst into flame. The fire flared bright, then burned out quickly, leaving behind only tendrils of steam. Freddy's distant laughter echoed on the night air. Jerome got to his feet, mind racing. He had to get home, and he had to get there fast. He couldn't walk, and he couldn't just wish himself there. This might be the dreamscape, but he didn't have the sort of power here. Only Freddy did. Jerome would have to find a more mundane method of transportation. Becca had said the dream Springwood was a copy of the real one. If buildings and streets were duplicated, then maybe cars were too. The Lexus wouldn't have been here. His other self would have taken it in the real world, so the copy would be gone. But Elle had to have driven something to pick up Cheryl. Probably his parents' car. They always parked behind the building, so Elle would have too. The copy of the car should be there, just waiting for him, once he retrieved the duplicate of the keys. He turned toward the entrance to Showtime Video. He did not want to go back in there and face the broken, yet still animated corpses of Elle and his parents. But that's where the keys would be, most likely in Elle's pants pocket. Jerome took a deep breath, then started toward the door. Okay, this has been chapters 20, 21, and 22 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. Hope everybody's enjoying it so far. Tomorrow I will be uploading the conclusion to this book. And the day after that, I'll begin reading A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Dealers. And I cannot wait for y'all to hear The Dream Dealers. It's a really, really good Freddy book. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Please click that like button. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropping. Please spread the word out there and let more fans know we're here. Tune in tomorrow. I'll be announcing the winner of the Jason X The Experiment giveaway. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
pleasant dreams!